Hi, John. Got actually gonna switch to this new Zoom, which I just updated the call with. Sorry
Okay.
about that. Yeah, it looks like oh wait. Hold on. Not that one. Not that one. Wait, let me just double check here. Did I click on the No, it is this one. Never mind. They swapped some stuff around.
No worries. Where did you put that?
Oh no. So what happened was at some point I can't remember if it was you or somebody else was mentioning that somebody had inadvertently canceled the actual meeting invite on the OpenSSF calendar, and so I got them to re-add it, and I wanted to make sure when looking into the notes that like it was still the same Zoom ID, because I didn't want it. If folks were looking at the actual notes, they would see if they looked at the notes, they would see one invite, and if they looked at the community call, they'd see it. Sorry, if they looked at the actual calendar invite, they'd see a different thing. And I
do
wanted to make
neither of those, right? Like I have my own hold on my work calendar to jump in, so I have to like copy it from the So it is the same. It's the same then.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Good. Then I don't have to update my calendar.
Yeah, same. Cool. So gonna give it a couple minutes for some folks to join. Also gonna try and get some additional folks here. All right, give me a couple of seconds here. So most folks, it looks like, I guess, because of some folks are still on vacation, but also a few folks are going to probably be a little late because of an overlapping meeting. But yeah, let me also ask Brendan here. And also put this in Fresca chat. All right. All right, cool. We can get started. Yeah, so half of the folks will probably be there. We'll be here on the bottom half of the hour. All right, so feel free to put your name in. Okay, looks like name in the attendees. Just as a reminder here, here is the here's this. So not a whole lot on the agenda right now. I know we were talking about potentially going through some roadmap stuff. And I think one of the things that, but before we get into that, I wanted to talk through the conversation with David Wheeler. Cool. So just to just as a reminder, this meeting's being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly thereafter. Also, your participation in this meeting is an agreement to the CNC, the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. So used to the other one. Cool. And so yeah, so and for folks who are just joining now, feel free to put your attendance in the notes, as well as anything you want to add into the agenda. But we can get started. So a lot of stuff getting done. So yesterday I was able to actually, another thing before even getting into that. Or it's the talk or the TAC. I always forget with OpenSSF. 1 second. It is the TAC. Okay. So was at the TAC meeting yesterday, gave a little bit of an update on the supply chain integrity stuff. So this is both Salsa as well as Fresca. A lot of folks were still not super familiar with Fresca. They were like, oh, hey, we actually didn't know we had this thing. Because I guess it didn't really get talked about too much in one of the updates, previous updates. So I brought them up to speed a little bit more on what's going on with Fresca. There were some potential logistical sort of administrative things like, hey, Fresca is in the BuildSec org. Does it make more sense in the OSSF org? I had brought up the original conversations we had on this with some of the OpenSSF folks, which is just, if you look at BuildSec org right now, and actually let me just go and share my screen on some of this just to walk you through. The BuildSec Fresca. So if I do this, share screen. So in here, there is a bunch of, if I go to the BuildSec org itself, we have a bunch of stuff in there, and there's the expectation is we'll probably have another dozen or so example repos, a couple of things that are specific to a couple of things that are specific to like Fresca. It's hold on, okay, I do not know what's going up with my PC lately, but every time I share my screen, it has been acting quite strange. Give me 1 second. All right. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, seems to be okay now. So there's going to be a bunch of stuff in here. There's probably going to be a bunch of like evil repos and stuff like that. And because there's all that bad stuff in there, we probably want to not include that all under OpenSSF, right? Because you were going to flood the OpenSSF repo, org in GitHub with a bunch of nasty stuff, and it doesn't really make sense. Whereas here we want to kind of make that clean. But one of the things that we did talk about is it might make sense to move Fresca into OpenSSF and have the example repos in something like BuildSec and just leave it there. And we can have those extra repos live here, but maybe Fresca can, because one of the things that they want to do is they also want to be able to push certain things and make it very easy from the OpenSSF metrics perspective. So that sounded pretty neat. Still on that end as well, still waiting on the logo stuff. There's some folks who had been assigned to do the logo stuff, but nobody's actually reached out to me directly to talk through getting the logo for Fresca. And so wanted to kind of talk through with them through some of that. So, with that said, the next sort of thing here is also had a discussion with David Wheeler from the Linux Foundation about what can we be doing a little bit more to help grow the community, to help do a whole bunch of stuff here. There is some interesting thoughts he had. One of his big ones was we should be building a roadmap so that it's very, very, very clear where folks see this thing going. And he said, it could just be a separate, one of the things that he had brought up was OpenSSF has their own roadmap thing. And let me bring this up once I pull up my notes. David Wheeler. So actually it's under OSSF. All right. There was there is a roadmap thing somewhere in here. Is it a planning committee? No. Maybe it was here. In one of these things, he was telling me about there is a roadmap element somewhere, or like maybe it's the roadmap. Yeah, I'll find it later. But he did bring up that there is a roadmap, and the idea which should be that we kind of really push the roadmap so that it makes it very clear what folks can expect coming out of Fresca. Yeah. Okay, 1 second here. Yeah. Okay. And so that's that. So David also brought up a couple of things just to be aware of that we can actually ask for from the OpenSSF for this. One is a website and help with building out a website specifically for Fresca. He also said, given that OpenSSF has so many connections with all the various big cloud providers, we can probably get cloud credits for the dev environment. Right now we do have a dev environment, but it's not officially funded through the OpenSSF, and ideally we'd want it funded through the OpenSSF. Also was saying that if we wanted translations on our documentation into different languages, we can definitely get that done as well as anything else there. He was also saying that, an interesting idea that we might want to play with is using Fresca as a secondary builder for some open source tools, right? So he was saying how, there's a lot of existing infrastructure, with GitHub and GitLab and a lot of stuff there, as well as some custom infrastructure for stuff like Kubernetes, as well as the Linux kernel. But it might be useful to sort of say, hey, if Fresca can build these things as well, and it's trying to do the sort of latest and greatest security, maybe we can have some secondary builders and then compare Salsa results, compare build results to make sure that, as we are trying to secure the supply chain, that sort of thing. Cool.
So how long would it take to get the websites and stuff, considering how long the logo took?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so it sounds like because it sounds like the main issue has been because like from about August to October is essentially just crunch time for KubeCon.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where they've been, hyper focused.
Right.
But I think the problem that we've run into is it seems like there's every few weeks there is some Linux Foundation
event going on,
conference, or event, right? Because next week is the OpenSSF or the Open Source Summit in Dublin, and then a couple of weeks after that, or a month after that, is KubeCon, and then like another month after that is a couple of conferences that they're having in Asia, and then a couple of months after that is once again so it seems to be a fairly consistent sort of schedule. So stuff on that end. I had talked to them also about what sorts of things can we do from that perspective for getting some of this done, right? Like, hey, if we have a thing here, we don't want to constantly be in this this world of asking for things and then just sort of sitting around waiting, having no idea what's going to go on, or who is you know, that sort of thing. So I think we're interested in figuring out like how we can have a better relationship there. So that's something that we've been talking through. Cool. What else?
So I can do a quick update.
Sure, yeah.
So in terms of, I think most people are aware about this, but basically Fresca is currently like, salsa level 2, but because we're waiting on the upstream things to merge, some of the things that I worked on is the getting salsa level 3, right? The non-falsifiable provenance. So that is still actively being reviewed, or it's actively, we're trying to get actively reviewed so that we can get pushed in into Fresca, basically. So once it's merged upstream in Tecton pipelines and Tecton chains, right, Fresca will become salsa level 3 compliant based off the non-falsifiable provenance and such. So we are actively working on getting that pushed. Because it's such a complicated, right? Because it's introducing Spire and such, it's taking much longer. Just for a lot of the people in Tecton pipelines, especially the maintainers, are not aware of exactly how Spire works and such. So they're doing their due diligence, and which it should be. So it's moving along. So that should be hopefully pushed. At least parts of it should be pushed going forward. So that's moving. And also the other piece is the runtime, right? So the other piece that I think we discussed in a couple meetings is like, hey, how do we use Tetragon to get some runtime visibility for the builds? So we've actually been working together, a bunch of us actually. So Shripad from Intel now, and a couple people from ChainGuard and the Aditya, who's an Intoto maintainer. We're all kind of coming together. We're meeting every 2 weeks. And we're trying to figure out exactly how the runtime attestation should look. So we're trying to actively work through that. And if there are, and because we have connections into Tetragon now, so we can say like, hey, if there's something missing or if there's something that we would want, we're trying to push Tetragon in that direction, saying like, hey, let's start capturing something that maybe is needed that's currently missing out of the box with Tetragon. So we're brainstorming on that, and then we'll also work with Tetragon to capture specific information that we would require. So if once we have that new runtime predicate, right, runtime attestation, we can use that going forward to make policy decisions and such. So all that work is moving along, and it's basically upstream of Fresca, but once it's all merged in, it's gonna it'll all flow into Fresca and make it a complete system.
Oh yeah. Can we include some of that in the notes?
Yes. Yeah, I'll put some links in right now.
Cool. And then also for you, John, one of the things that I think was really interesting that we're trying to kind of figure out is so we are also looking to maybe do our own OSCAL mapping for Fresca, so that like, hey, Fresca, and so this is a thing that I know that like Trestle and some of these other tools are trying to do, is this idea of being able to tag elements of code or applications themselves or configuration and tag it so that you can say, well, this is actually proof that I have implemented this control because, this configuration deploys this tool and this tool satisfies that control or something like that. And so we're looking at, how could we start to there's probably going to be a set of cloud native controls, SALSA, SSDF, NIST 853, yada, 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 161, that Fresca will essentially, it will handle those things and also both from a production standpoint of, hey, this helps out with the secure build and secure development, as well as be both also as well as be a consumer of certain things, like self-implementing those controls, right? Because the way that Fresca is built is built to also be operated securely. And there's going to be a whole bunch of things that it just naturally does as well. And so I think we kind of wanted to see where we can potentially collaborate a little bit with, the controls working group or whatever else, to kind of figure out like what is a good way for us to sort of make those claims in a way that, could be asserted by a third party eventually, right? Like what can we do to say, yes, we are implementing this CNCF control, right? Or rather, to take a step back, those two things, right? There is the one is Fresca as a tool in and of itself needs to have certain controls assessed against itself, right? Because, hey, it's operating in a certain way and we need to make sure it's operating securely. But then separately, Fresca as a tool itself is implementing controls for the SDLC and for the cloud. And so where, what sorts of things can we start to do to sort of build out those mappings in a way that, is, let's say, the CNCF standardized way or whatever is kind of moving in that direction, or the OSCAL standardized way if the CNCF and others sort of adopt it. Have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, there's a ton going on in that space. I've been working with OpenSSF, CNCF, CIS, and CSA right now, primarily on these different sort of like mapping efforts, and then evaluating. The way that I look at it is, in order to claim that you are accomplishing a control, you need to provide evidence, right? And so we need to map the evidence through different parts of like OSCAL, like the security assessments side, to the controls side. So we have just really started to do that. And I think there's some upstream work happening at NIST on the OSCAL side. I forget exactly. It's still a work in progress. It's not done yet in the spec. But we're working with AJ from NIST on that as well. I guess so. It's something that we're thinking about and working on, but we don't have anything concrete right now. We're trying to, on the controls project, focus our scope a little bit. And so you're talking about doing a roadmap. We just did a V1 of a roadmap that we have out for peer review, same sort of issue, but also there's a lot of ideas and there's a lot of people interested, and we can't boil the ocean. So we're trying to get something over the finish line. What you're talking about is close to the top of our priorities for sure. I was actually wondering if so I got a couple of things. One is we were actually looking to point in our work, we have implementation details, right? How would you do this? We were looking to maybe point to Fresca as a concrete way to implement some sort of a control, given a specific tool, right? So if you're using Tecton and Tecton chains, here's how you might do X. That's something that we may be interested in the future. But yeah, we've got a lot of things still getting fleshed out. Once we finalize that roadmap, and we'll be presenting that roadmap to the security tag in the CNCF. And once that finalizes, we'll get a little bit more concrete with work. We've got 3 main work streams right now, and one of the 3 is that kind of like, how do you automatically gather evidence and map it to controls to say that your implementation is accomplishing something. And I know there's a lot of commercial tools that are already doing that. That's a huge market, right? That controls validation market or whatever, like the Dradas and Bantas and Tugboat and, a million different tools and getting billions of dollars of funding. I'm not seeing a great centralized open source alternative to those. And that's kind of what we're thinking might be a good approach. Related to all of that, I was wondering if your AFF work, is that related to this like Fresca at all, or is that disjointed from here?
It is related somewhat. So AFF has actually been renamed to Guac to make it to sort of follow the salsa theme, and that sort of thing. But yeah, so so Guac is trying to also do something similar, right? Where the idea would be all this metadata, all this signed metadata ends up in a graph. And you could imagine, Fresca, a thing there is we could easily hook into it so that, you can make questions, you could ask questions of your build, say, hey, we're about to build this thing. When we pull in dependencies, can we also pull in, did those dependencies go through appropriate scans? Do they have the right salsa attestations? Do they have SBOMs and so on? And then how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Like, or how deep in the turtles, the stack of turtles do you want to go? Do we have attestations that everything was built, on approved hardware? Maybe yes, maybe no, but like even just having some of that information, you can start to have some of those build out some of those policies. And so one of the things that we would love to be able to kind of start to explore is a little bit of that, also that control space of, could we integrate with, let's say some combination of the big vendor tools, but also, if some of the stuff starts getting built out in the open source space, these are things that I think are going to be hugely important with OzCal. And I've been champing at the bit for to kind of get back into OzCal, because I think it is prime, it is primed for doing some really cool stuff, right? I would love to be able to say, here is a control catalog, CNCF control catalog. That CNCF control catalog has OzCal mappings to salsa, to all these other things. So if you do one control, oh, great, you do these other controls. And where there might not be a control mapping, you might have to say, great, well, here's not a control, there is no appropriate CNCF control that maps directly to salsa or maps directly to SSDF. So here's how we have to if let's say we're doing both, here's how we would do both. And I think the thing that we want to be able to do there then is to say, great, let's start building some additional tools in this space to do some of those assertions. And then ideally, we could push all that information into something like Guac or whatever.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So on my side of the projects, like on the control side, it would be more like being a client to something like a Guac, right? To craft the right queries and provide the UI UX side and make it a little bit more user friendly potentially. I don't know if that's in the plans for Guac or not, but then also trying to work with projects to get their information into Guac, and maybe even providing some glue automation to say, well, you might not be Guac aware, but I am, and I know how to talk to you. So I'm going to investigate you, extract information, and I'm going to input it into this graph database. And then I'm going to jump over to this other, perspective where I'm going to query Guac and say, am I doing this thing well enough? Or am I meeting whatever my company's expectations are? Yes or no, policy fail, allow, that sort of a thing. The mapping conversation actually really interesting. So we did a mapping exercise in the controls framework where we took the white paper, CNCF white paper, the cloud native security white paper, and this software supply chain best practices. And we extracted those controls, mapped them to 853 R5. And then I've been talking to people about them, and we talked with 3M, they implemented it in their company, a few others, and talking with CIS and CSA as well. And they seem to have a much more mature idea of how to do these cross framework mappings and cross controls in different frameworks mappings, much more mature than the way that we had done it. And so now we are talking with them about an open standard on how to even do those mappings, because there's lots of can you have composable controls, these 3 in framework A equal this 1 in framework B? Yep. Or are there intersections or overlaps or supersets or subsets, and how do you represent that information? How do you put all of that stuff in a bundle that's actually useful? I think CSA and CIS have both done that a lot, and they've done it differently. And we're kind of coming together now to say, egos aside, what's the best way to do this? And from what I'm hearing, CSA has a really good approach that is more effective and less complicated than CIS's. CIS did a bigger engineering effort for their mapping framework, but in the real world, it hasn't been turning out so well. So all of that to say, I'm going to be working with them and NIST to figure out this mapping stuff and make sure that we're getting everything, all of the bits and pieces we need in OSCAL. And then, if we have a graph database where evidence is collected, that would be a prime point where the controls work would be a consumer of that information, and then also be like a loader of that information where projects might not natively know about it.
Cool. Yeah. I think that's really interesting and important there. Like, this is a big thing for us as well, and this is kind of where we were thinking with the NIST stuff or whatever. It's like, how do you it's not the NIST stuff, the OSCAL stuff or whatever, like, is there like a way in OSCAL to do that mapping? I know that, and do that sort of like superset, like have collections of things, make sure that that's sort of clear. Yeah. And to kind of go back to your other point a little bit, yeah, the idea here, right, is, we want to be able to sort of have folks who use Guac be able to push stuff into their own personal Guac, into the open source Guac, because there's going to be also a public service that's being run by Google. That will be sort of a public open source graph, similar to Recore and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Sorry, were you saying that the public service would be like a implementate, like a running environment?
A running environment that anybody could, let's say, make queries against, but obviously within bounds, right? Because that could be very easily abused, very easily denial of service and that kind of thing. So the idea would be, you can make some basic requests like, hey, get me all salsa attestations in the tree associated with this thing. But you might not be able to, let's say, do, hyper complicated queries or whatever of like, hey, does this specific, element of this specific thing have some path to this other thing? Probably not. That you might need to run your and so on.
Yeah. So that does that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I threw a link in the chat here to one of the issues that are open on the OSCAL project that we're kind of tracking, which is roles. I think has some overlap with the things that we're talking about here, which is like, how do you test and know, providing guidance in kind of both directions for a project on how to identify if a control's in place and things like that. So there's a ton of work going on. We could have the whole meeting on this topic, but
yeah, cool. Yeah, definitely interested in, and I will also put this in some of the stuff in the agenda. Yeah,
unfortunately I have to drop as well for a 10:30 then late for.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, good chat. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, we'll chat offline. I think the big thing that we want to make sure of is hey, as some of these other things are being ramped up, we're okay with being the guinea pig on, like, let's see, what this looks like. Let's build a prototype of it. Let's get on there. I think that's going to be pretty big. Cool. Well, I see that some of the other folks have joined now that their overlapping meeting is over. So let me copy paste the document. Feel free to add your name. I'm probably going to be hashing a handful of things. Okay. And as you folks are kind of getting spun up, just to kind of run you through a little bit of the topics that we were talking about before. So had a discussion at the TAC meeting yesterday. There was some concern about like how we've set up the org. And I said, hey, I've set up the org with the OpenSSF in these ways. And they went, oh, okay. That might not be the best route moving forward. And it's like, okay, fine. What can we do? So waiting on hear back from the OpenSSF on some of that, on, you know, whether that sort of makes sense. And one of the ideas was just from a marketing and metrics and everything else perspective, it might just make sense to have Fresca, the main Fresca, exist in another, like in the OSSF org, but maybe have all the example projects exist in its own org. And, you know, because the example projects are not intended to be used by people directly, except literally as examples. They're not really intended to be this like a core component of Fresca, whereas Fresca itself, you know, if it just has one or two repos, makes sense to have it be in OSSF. So that was one thing that was discussed yesterday in the TAC meeting. There was also some conversations where it sounded like a lot of folks were still surprised that Fresca is a thing. So we're trying to kind of push folks, get folks aware of Fresca, market a little bit more, which then kind of led into the next topic, which was I had a conversation with David Wheeler last week, just generally about, hey, how do you, like, look, there's no, you know, magic formula for how a project becomes successful, but what sorts of things, you know, do you recommend? You know, what sorts of things do you recommend? And he was, you know, he brought up a couple of good ideas. One was we should definitely build out a bit of a roadmap. And I don't think we have the time right now here, but if a few folks wanted to offline on the Slack or whatever, just start talking through like a legitimate, you know, here is the vision, the vision of like, let's say the next year of where we want to push this. You know, for example, as you know, a builder for certain projects and yada yada, as the, you know, a really ideal state of a secure builder. He said that, you know, that sort of thing seems like it would be really valuable. He also brought up a couple of different things around what OpenSSF can kind of provide us a little bit, you know. So one is like building a logo, still waiting on that. I think a lot of those folks are super busy prepping for KubeCon. So I've been seeing that a lot of their stuff has been super busy on that end. Also, you know, potentially get some more official support via cloud credits and that kind of thing, so that we can run in multiple environments, whether GCP, AWS, so on and so forth. They could also help out with stuff like translations, reviewing documentation for, you know, general like clarity, that kind of thing. Because I think, you know, we're those of us who've been working on the project, you know, we're all hands-on keyboard engineers. You know, we know how to write stuff for other engineers, but sometimes if it's folks who are like not already super familiar with the space, it could be very confusing. And so they, you know, we can potentially ask folks on that end. Also, you know, some of the stuff that's kind of coming out of Fresca, you know, they did say, you know, we can make submissions to the TAC, and then the TAC reviews it. And then if like, so for example, if we wanted to get actual money for something, I don't know what, like, let's say a threat model, a few folks have been asking Fresca for a threat model. Great. If Fresca, if we want a threat model, then, you know, we can ask, we can push that to the TAC. The TAC does a review, and then technically that goes up to the governing board. But I've been told that largely the governing board, unless it's like a ridiculous ask, we'll just sort of say, hey, yeah, the TAC asked for this thing, we have the money for it, you know, we'll approve it. So that's just something to sort of think through. Also, I have an email, operations@openssf.org. Pretty much that's the email to just sort of, if you have a request, ask there. Like if you don't know how to make a request for a thing, like, hey, I don't know, you know, we want to kind of include, we want to, you know, have help with building out the website, go to operations@openssf.org. They will then come back with, hey, here's a link to open up the ticket or whatever. And they'll help us route there. They are working towards making it maybe a bit more user-friendly, but that seems to be the current thing there. What else? That seems to be the majority of stuff from like, what we could maybe start to do to make this a little bit more successful. One of the other things that we had discussed, and this is what I had sort of talked about earlier, was potentially making Fresca like a secondary builder for certain open source tools. It sounds like, a lot of open source tools nowadays are, using GitHub Actions, using GitLab. Some of them have custom build infrastructure like Kubernetes in the Linux kernel itself. But some of the conversations were like, hey, it might still make sense given some of the stuff that's happening with Salsa and yada yada, is if you can make a secondary builder and you can say, great, we ran it against 2 builders, we ran tests against both of those. They might not be binarily, might be binary reproducible, but they're relatively the same based on all the tests we ran against both. That might do some increased confidence around the security. It might also help get OpenSSF Fresca a little bit of funding to actually, run some of those builds and be seen as kind of like, hey, this is an actual sort of thing there. They asked, David brought up a couple of good pieces of feedback just to be like, hey, make it sure it's hyper clear what the focus of the project is. Is it purely just a, this is what it could look like, and now everybody go and do your own thing? Is Fresca intended to be also, it's, an actual project that is taking those tools, stringing them together and releasing that as like a package out to the world? If that's the case, make that sure it's clear. If it's both, make sure it's very clear, and those sort of things. And then also work with the OpenSSF on just, showing what this thing can do and demoing and yada yada to start building some of that support. Does that make sense to folks? Cool. On that end, right, do folks have ideas around like some of those things, like especially folks who are not super familiar with Fresca? Do folks have thoughts around like, what could we be doing to make this easier for you to understand? Are there things that you like about Fresca that you're like, hey, I wish you were doing more of this? If there are things you don't like about Fresca and you wish we were doing less of, curious to hear folks' thoughts. I know, Matt, you've had a couple of thoughts in the past. I was curious if you had any thoughts. Yeah, so Tecton, so we have been looking at doing something like an operator for it. And from what we noticed is the way that operators seem to work is that it's kind of hard to have an operator of operators, because in this case, if we include the Tecton operator, it kind of messes with how Fresca itself works internally. And so we would need to create like essentially an operator that manages the Tecton operator in addition to potentially other operators like, Spiffy Spire and Kyverno and whatever else. Or we need to develop a whole new operator that manages all of those things. And to be clear, we're very much open to it. There seems to be a lot of like, as a lot of these, as you begin to add more and more components into something that an operator is responsible for, it begins to get very, very, very complicated. Not to say that that's not just the nature of how these things are working, but I'd be curious to maybe get some thoughts on what we might be able to do on there.
It goes to easy installation. I mean, a lot of us stub Tecton, we've already hung off a lot of our own components off these things. We've already set up our own ways to track controls, evidence lockers, and a bunch of stuff like that. But it'd be nice, you're talking about creating a refs implementation. If there was at least a set of, that's the whole point, is somebody's really experienced creates the operator, so now everyone else doesn't have to.
Yep.
So, but at least it's a serious, what's the easy up method? How do I, or what's the, if I install base Tecton, what are the adds? What's the simple install instructions, and what's the verification to make sure they're installed, and the operator achieves the version update stuff. So that's why I said operator.
Yeah. No. And to be clear, yes. I think that is the end goal, right? Is to, it is like the operator becomes sort of like the package, right? At some level, the operator becomes the thing that goes and deploys out and updates and does whatever else, but is the thing that actually deploys out all the components, make sure that everything is running. If, let's say, something dies in the middle of something, it makes sure that it comes back up. And I think that is going to be really valuable, or, either the operator or something like the operator, because, I know that there's
it doesn't have the operator. That's just the embodiment.
Yeah. No, and to be clear, I definitely think that is very much required. I think so Brad and Brendan, I know you guys have been thinking about some of this as well. Have you any thoughts?
I just haven't written an operator because I haven't done one yet. So that's probably one of the.
I mean, if that's the direction
big
I want to go down,
blocks.
I mean, I've got an expert or claimed worldwide expert who's done it for Knative and a couple other projects. So I mean, I can bring them into the conversation if we have that. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No. Definitely would love to get like additional input there. But yeah, I think on that level, yeah, I think one of the big things that is missing from what we're doing with Fresca is a way to install Fresca in an actual, to be clear, Fresca is not production ready, but today people are just like, how do I install it? And it's a bunch of make commands and yada, yada, which is, still useful, but like the idea should still be, hey, how do folks sort of like, what is that initial configuration so that folks can come in and say, great, here is my root of trust, here's my cert bundle, here's my this, that, and the other thing, or here, generate it for me, or whatever. Like be able to have some of those options to then, one use case is make it simple for people who are developing Fresca itself. If you are somebody who's building out features for Fresca, and then secondarily, if you plan to develop based on stuff that is happening in Fresca, right? You want to go and say, great, I want to deploy, just as an example, like, oh, I'm planning to move off of CI tool foo, and I want to move over to Fresca. What would that start to look like? I want to, deploy a dev version of Fresca and start to poke around with, kick the tires, poke around with it. What does that look like? I think that's kind of, the end goal here. And I think, an operator would be great. If not an operator, there's, I know a few other folks have said, does it make sense to have like a Helm chart, like a huge Helm chart, or a way to,
or a Helm chart within an operator?
Yes. Yeah. Or whatever. Right. And I think that sort of thing is stuff that we're interested in, while still trying to maintain as simple as possible, like configuration for the end user. Like we want to make sure, like we want to give folks all the knobs that they, all the knobs to tweak. But we also want to make sure, I think, that if the 80% use case is somebody's just going to say, here's my, here's the certs I trust, like here's my cert bundle, or even use a default cert bundle that we, or whatever, and just take care of the rest for me, I think is kind of like where most folks are going to, start to ask. Because like already we've seen this a little bit, is most people are saying, well, the reason why I'm not, like the reason why I don't use, let's say, Tecton plus chains plus, configured all these things, is that configuring all those things actually does take a lot of time and effort to sort of build out and think out, and the Spire stuff that, Parth is pushing out and so on. And the Vault stuff that Brendan pushed out is like, hey, deploying all these things in the right ways is actually hard. And I think we've done so far. I don't want to toot my own horn, but to be clear, I didn't write most of this code, so I'm willing to praise Brad, Brandon, and Parth. Is like, I think they've done a great job at actually making the configuration relatively simple and straightforward, so that, hey, you just sort of deploy this thing and it's ready and roaring and ready to go, where now you automatically get, you have a new project, and you automatically get all these different things, and the policy is already there and all that good stuff. And as we are adding additional features, the operation of this thing is not what we've seen in the past of a lot of these sort of CI tools, is like, hey, and this is the problem, I think, in stuff we brought up with the Tecton team. And I know they're working on fixing this with some of the trusted tasks and so on and so forth. But this idea of making it simple for the end user, so that if the end user doesn't care about what task is being run, they just say, hey, I have a build pack, let's say, and I just want the build pack to run, and I just want to give you a build pack, and I want the build pack, I want the pipeline to figure out like generating the SBOM and all these different things. And I think we've done a pretty good job at getting that scaffolding set up. It's not going to work in all use cases, but even if it works in 80% use cases, it would be, I think, huge. Cool. So I actually wanted to talk through a little bit. So Brendan and Brad, and I know there's been some work on the Tecton Triggers piece. Did you want to just give a short, quick update on what's kind of going on there and what you've been thinking about?
Yeah, for that side, I've just been slowly building up that delineation between how people are going to hopefully use this in production later on, which is that developers aren't going to be logging onto the cluster with kubectl access and running make commands. They're going to be committing code into a Git repo. So got the first half of that, the Git repos are getting mirrored over, and I've got the proof of concept a little bit of the first one. I'm going through the rest of the repos now to get things moved over to that same model where we set the Tecton trigger, and then we want to show the example of running. I just log into that example Git repo and just submit an empty commit, and you can see that run through the pipeline. So that's the overall goal, just trying to get to look more like the final result of how this is going to look when it's deployed in production. And then the other piece, I think, going a little bit to the Tecton operator, is we need to figure out how to split this all up. And so split up the developer environment, the Kubernetes deploy versus the actual install of what we're doing, because in a production environment, you're not going to want to deploy the example Golang packages.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're trying to go down that path of separating out, what the core components of Fresca are and what's like the support pieces, and then what are the examples, right? So I think we're moving down that path, and I think eventually we can do something that we can have something that's more of an automated like install with like an operator or something.
Yeah. And I think also, one of the things that kind of comes up is, I think as we kind of, and this is maybe something I'll add on to the roadmap stuff that we should talk about, and probably set up for anybody who's interested, set up like an hour meeting just to kind of literally just go through that, or maybe even set up next meeting to go through that, something like that. The thing that I'd be interested in is just like, because one of the other things I think is just, what is that abstraction for the end user, right? Like, how does, we're trying to kind of say, hey, look, you don't have to think about Tecton tasks unless you have to, right? So, you could imagine, right? And this is, I know, is actually kind of one of the problems we've run into with just sort of just Tecton, if you're just using Tecton just generically. And to be clear, it's with any CI system because it's not really intended for that purpose. But it's that idea of like, hey, if I'm just another Go project, I just want to be able to use the Go pipeline. And yeah, there is that pipeline element in Tecton, and you could just say, hey, here's my, either you could just sort of create a pipeline template that uses that, or you could also use a, you could also have a pipeline point to multiple, a pipeline talk to multiple things, and just individual pipeline runs end up calling different code. But at some level like that, where is the distinction between there, and what's the distinction between, let's say, a project and let's say a team, and what access should they be getting to individual things, and what access should they get to customize their actual pipeline? And I think that's kind of where we're trying to focus around stuff like with the queue abstraction and some of the other stuff, is if folks can come in and, if you're a team that's, once again, just another Go project, great, your interface, and this is something that came in with the CD Foundation. They had a blog around, they called it intent-based pipelines, which is stuff that it looks like we are pretty much building out here, but this idea of, hey, most folks don't care whether or not like they're going through all these different linting steps or whatever. They just care, like, did I go through the right steps? Did the right things, did the goals get hit, right? Did did my code get checked for vulnerabilities in a way that is acceptable to the organization or to the project? Yes, cool. Because not everybody needs to know about, oh yes, this tool scans for passwords in your stuff, right? Great. I don't need to know about the minutia of how that tool works, just that it, that goal is being addressed, that problem's being addressed. Yeah, so this is, the intent-based stuff is interesting. So if you're the CD Foundation is taking a kind of an interesting approach. They are actually trying to take the approach of non-technical as much as possible. So they're trying to say, hey, look, we want to focus on not completely non-technical, but less technical, I should say. They're focused around stuff like getting people to address they want to address stuff like, what was I going to say? They want to address stuff like how legal gets involved in software delivery and how marketing gets involved in software delivery and stakeholders and so on and so forth, so that, they're a little bit less focused on literally the CD tool, as in, the tool that pushes it out, though that's important. They're more concerned with, what does the flow look like and what does that process look like? And then how do we then talk to, let's say, other Linux Foundation groups to make sure that those things are being hit in technical ways. Like, as you can imagine, right? If license checking is a huge piece of what you need to do, do folks in the various projects know that that needs to get done? And so that's kind of some of the stuff with the intent-based pipeline. Like at the end of the day, right, the developer maybe doesn't need to, like, they don't want to know that 5 layers deep in their dependency tree, there's a bad license. They just want to know that there is a problem there and they need to deal with it. And so that's kind of where I think a lot of that stuff is coming in, and where we want to help enable that. And, there's a couple of different terms for this, whether it's governance as code or intent-based pipelines or that sort of thing. And I think one of the key goals for Fresca is, how do we do that from the secure build space? How do we make it really, really simple so that developers who, yes, they care about security, but don't understand all the minutia around every little element, can sort of focus on what they are sort of experts in.
Well, it's actually interesting that you showed that, because I was looking at the YAML. So it looks like it's focused on intent, like basically abstracting out deployment. So you basically give the minimum requirements without specifying the actual target hardware or APIs or whatever. So that is, I see the intent-based modeling. I think that's an excellent way to approach, looking at Fresca. It's like, and what Parth was saying earlier, which parts are optional or can be replaced out. It's what's the abstractions, what's the core, what are the optional abstractions, what are the default configurations, and then what's the interface? How do you abstract it out so that you can actually do replacement? I've long been wondering how we put in perhaps hardware keys or key management service keys in place of other keys. How do we replace those out? What's the abstraction for that? Anyways.
Yeah, and that's something that I think I know I would love to spend hours and hours with Brad to kind of think through some of that stuff, because I totally agree, because like at the end of the day, what we would love to be able to have is those pipelines essentially be, if you think about it and I know we only have a minute here, but at one level of abstraction should be, it's a bundle of your policy, your tasks, your triggers, your pipelines, your any sort of Spire configuration. All these different configurations should all be sort of bundled up, but then there should be even higher level abstractions on top of it that are like, well, not every team needs to understand all the minutia there, and so at the end of the day, like the actual end user maybe only needs a handful of actual parameters they need to fill in, and everything else is filled in by default, right? Like any other function or whatever, but you might still give folks some access to some parameters they can tweak, right? oh, our Go library requires this different linting tool because we have a specific need and we allow you to override that. Okay, cool. You can plug that in. Your configuration is a little bit more complicated than others, but it's still, you're getting still a lot of that additional lift. And I think that's kind of really one of the two main goals of Fresca. The first goal is sort of the, secure build and sort of this, the hopefully the shining beacon of what could be there. And then the second goal of it is how do we do that in, how do we build those guardrails? Like, how do we build that abstraction as guardrails so that, developers who don't need to know about, every little thing, they don't need to know about all the legal requirements, all that sort of stuff gets, all the security requirements, all that just gets done for you. But yeah. Cool. Well, so we're at time. Sorry for talking so much, but I'll see you all in 2 weeks. And I'll probably reach out to some of you on Slack. Later.
Cheers.